Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, and today the topic is going to be universals. We're going to look at the Platonic idea of universals, and particularly what we want to do today is kind of trace the universal idea through medieval thought. And for our listeners, this is the course that's currently being offered by Dr. Smith. An entire, 15 weeks, I believe, 15 weeks
Sure.
of medieval philosophy, where we trace all kinds of lines of thought and look at it from both a thematic perspective, but also looking at it in a historical perspective as well. So if that's something that may interest you, check us out at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com for our courses there. And so, Dr. Smith, all right, to get us started today, maybe you can just kind of give our listeners kind of an introduction to the Platonic idea of universals, what it is, and then we'll start to trace it through medieval thought.
Sure. And Jason, you said for any of you who may be interested in medieval philosophy, I just want to say everyone who's thinking should be interested in medieval philosophy. Anyway, so the problem of universals, right? This is kind of like just a core stock issue for philosophy and the history of ideas. Anybody worth their salt, is going to know something about this topic and reflect on it. And you just really see it. I mean, it's just a permanent topic. I mean, even contemporary analytic philosophy talks about the problem of universals, right? So, what does this really come down to? Plato developed the idea of a universal idea or a universal form, and he was doing that in reaction to the sophist. The sophists were rhetoricians. And what the sophists were interested in was persuasive speech, power, and persuasion, but not necessarily truth, right? they thought that what basically that truth is in the eye of the beholder, right? And that if you could persuade the many that it was good to go to war with Sparta, then it was good to go to war with Sparta, and that's all there is to it. So Plato's sort of reacting against this idea, and in reaction, he develops the idea that no, look, there is such a thing as a universal form of justice, an idea of justice that applies to every instance and always, right? So those are the key features, always and every instance. That's what it means for there to be a universal idea. So we can say, for every man is mortal, right? That proposition is true if there is a universal man idea of man or form of man, right? That includes mortality, right? So that anytime you refer to a man, whether it's I don't know, Karl Marx, Napoleon, or Socrates, right? That there's of course differences between those three figures, right? Sure. But that there is an underlying foundational sort of common character to them that is unchanging and applies to every instance, right? Yep. Now you just think about, why is that important? If you have universals, right? If there are universal ideas or universal forms, then you can deduce necessary truths, right? So I can know that if Socrates is a man, then he is necessarily mortal, right? I can know that if Napoleon is a man, as august as he was in his time, then I can also still know that he's necessarily mortal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think this is important. This idea is important for, just language. I mean, I can't show you a rake and say, "Look at my chair," because the universal idea of a chair, or this is how we use the idea of universals. When I say chair, you're going to think of something with at least 3, maybe 4 rungs and a place to sit. So if I show you a rake, and this is where, kind of the use of the ideas come in handy.
Sure. I like that idea. Like, right now I'm getting my house remodeled, and so everything's kind of 6s and 7s around here. But so right now, literally my dryer and my washer are sitting in my living room. But if you came in and said, "Hey, man, what's wrong with why you get your washer in the living room?" I was like, "That's not my washer, man. That's my couch."
That's my yeah. It's my coffee table. Yeah.
What are you dissing on my coffee table for? Right? You would rightly say, "Well, wait a second. That's not a coffee table. Right? That's a washer." Right?
Yeah, yeah. So it's very important for not just philosophical thinking, especially when it comes to metaphysics, but just in speech and in our I don't think we always understand that we
Yeah.
use this idea of
Uh,
universals.
Yeah, so when I was teaching this in college or um, in let's say a logic class, right? I mean, I would just say, imagine trying to speak without common nouns,
Yeah,
right? I mean, if everything had to be a proper noun like New York City or Virginia, then like you would never get around to saying anything.
yeah,
It'd be impossible, right? Okay, so that's the basic issue, right, when it comes to universals. Now, the weird part about Plato is so Plato's, I mean, I just want to say Plato's genius, right? I mean, he's
right.
just right on about this in one way. In another way, he kind of got off track, but his idea was, well, if they're gonna be these universals, they have to exist apart from the world of experience.
Hmm.
And the reason is that everything in the world of experience is particular and changing, but forms or universal ideas are universal and unchanging. So you
Right.
can see his point, right?
Yeah.
So he posits the separate world of the forms. Now, that's very influential idea and somewhat attractive, although it's very hard to conceptualize what a separate world of ideas would be, right? Like
Yeah.
it's kind of mind bending to try to think. So there's like these real definitions just sort of existing, right, apart from anything particular or any particular mind, right? And Plato just says, yes, that's correct. Right? The world reality is strange. Now that though was picked up by Christian thinkers. You can find this all through the patristic period.
Sure.
Uh, in fact, I would say that Plato was probably I would say the first millennium of Christianity um, was more Neoplatonic or Platonic than any other philosophical school.
Sure.
And you can see why. But of course, there was an important transition here, and St. Augustine's a good example of this. And this is his way of approaching it is picked up also by St. Bonaventure. But this is the view that, well, okay, there are separate ideas, but those separate ideas are in the mind of God,
Hmm.
right? So that there is a mind that is thinking those ideas. They don't just sort of exist in a separate sort of reality, right?
Sure. Sure.
Um, so both St. Bonaventure and St. Augustine hold that view. Um, and then, you still have the question, the next question that arises is, well, okay, if there are these, I mean, when you think universals, the problem of universals, you really should just be thinking, are there any universal and unchanging truths, right?
Right.
And of course, Catholics have to say yes, and I would think, and Saint Augustine, Saint Bonaventure would say so. But then there's questions, well, how do we access them,
Hmm.
right? How do we get them, right? Because Saint Augustine, Saint Bonaventure were both agree with Plato that yeah, we can't get them out of the world of experience because the world of experience again is particular and
Particulars.
changing,
Yep.
right? You think about this with all the issues that we're going through right now, right? If you think, well, like, you know, to the Greeks, the idea that that they're there's men and women and something else, they would have thought, what are you talking about, right? So there's like like this form of human, and then we can divide that into male and female, right? Well, of course, people don't believe that as much today, at least in the United States of America and Europe, and so um, then that raises the kind of question of whether there are any universal and unchanging truths like men and women, right? That kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So Aristotle, I'm sorry, not Aristotle, St. Augustine, St. Bonaventure would say, yeah, there are in the mind of God, right? That's where those universal, unchanging truths exist, right? There are absolute truths, and God thinks them.
Yeah. Well, I think
Now
that's
that's attractive, right?
yeah, and I think that's that second question that you put there. How do we access them? I think that's the real interesting thing, because I think
Mm-hmm.
for the even the American believer, I think sometimes says, well, that's what I believe because I've accessed those, but I can't really show somebody my access to those. So the best we can do is believe, but with this like beginning point of skepticism. You know what I mean? And I think that's a kind of a big beginning place for a lot of people today is, well, I mean, we think they're male and female, but I mean, do we really know? You know, I mean, like they'll, they'll ask questions like that and stuff. So, I mean, I think that idea of, and I think it's because, our world, wants to, again, shut God out of it and say, well, we should be able to know these things without God, or we and we'll get to why that came up, or why is the way that it is, but I think that's kind of the modern point. So I mean, I think that's an important point for our listeners is, we have this idea of universals, we experience the idea of universals in particulars, but because we only experience these particulars, we never get at the unchanging truth, or we never get at the unchanging reality of what the thing actually is. So how is it that we access those? For St. Augustine, St. Bonaventure, it's in the mind of God. Which is great. Right, it's a great place to go.
That's right. Yeah. So I mean, from a sort of a Christian Platonic perspective, what you would say, if you just went with experience, right? What we experience, for St. Bonaventure is, he would say, what we experience is particular and changing, right? Yeah. And like anytime you say travel, right, you experience this, you start to learn some history, right? You learn, like not everybody drives on the right side of the road, not the traditional garb for women in certain Asian places are these kind of flowing pants like things, right? Or whatever, like, what I'm talking about? Like, so you start to learn like, or like hair differences and things like that there's a lot of change and diversity, right, across the world. And the Platonists would say, okay, that doesn't mean, though, there's no universal permanent truths. They just exist in the mind of God outside of experience. How do we access those? According to St. Bonaventure, we access them in two ways. There's at least two. He would say there's two illuminations, right? Okay. And of course, the highest and deepest is the illumination that is Christ, right? So that Christ is this sort of particular universal, concrete universal, right? Christ enters the world, right? And as the verbum, right, as the word, right, he contains all forms within himself. And so we get sort of the illumination that is Christ, and then the illumination in Scripture that's connected to Christ in faith, right? Now that, though, presupposes, in Bonaventure's view, a prior kind of illumination, and that is the illumination of forms. And so Bonaventure wants to start with the supposition that we do know things, right? This is a classic Platonic move. He'd say, do we know anything? Bonaventure would say, yes. Okay, well, what does that presuppose? Well, that presupposes that we have universal truths, right? Right. And but those universal truths can't come from us because we're changing, right? So, Gary, key move there, right? My mind is changing, so the universal truths can't come from me, and they can't come from what I experience because that's also changing. So they must come from an unchanging, perfect mind, namely God, right? Yeah. And so I think that's a neat little argument, right? Yeah. It's kind of St. Bonaventure, Platonic kind of style argument for the existence of a perfect mind that is illuminating our minds with universal and unchanging truth. You can see why Christians would find this so attractive, right? Oh yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is, the effects of original sin. The mind was darkened, the will was weakened, so I mean, like, before the fall, we experienced this communion with God, and part of that had to do with knowledge. Right. One of the preternatural gifts, right? And so, so for him to bring it up that way, yeah, that sounds good. It was darkened, but it wasn't, destroyed. We could still recognize or in a way like that, right. Those truths. Yeah, and it's important you bring up original sin, because the next subject excuse me, the next objection is, well, why don't I know everything, right? If God is illumining my mind, right? You hear the metaphor is like the sun shining, right?
Yeah.
So if you go outside, like especially on say a hot day, right? And you're trying, and it's clear sky. You're trying, like you don't want to be hot. Like the sun shines on you, whether you like it or not, right?
Yeah.
You're out there working in the field, it's beaming down, and you may not like it, but that's just the way it is. So why isn't it the case that why don't I have more knowledge? Why am I often ignorant or in error if God is shining his light, so to speak, on my mind? And that goes to the question of sin and impurity and moral corruption. Um, so, and interesting, Plato anticipates this, but both St. Augustine and St. Bonaventure would say, well, it's because of our distraction, right? We are distracted by things outside of us. We're distracted by the world, by lust, all those sorts of things. And because of that, as St. Augustine so powerfully puts it, we're sort of pulled outside ourselves and shattered into the many things, external things. The language he uses, right? We're just like poured out and just broken up outside of ourselves, which of course St. Augustine is a wonderful rhetorician. The St. Bonaventure doesn't use quite that dramatic language, but something similar, right? That is that we're drawn to the particular and the changing, and because of that, right? Especially because of original sin, that's why we're ignorant. We're ignorant because of our immorality. Again, you could see how powerful that is as a Christian idea. Go ahead, Jason.
Well, I was going to say now, what is Saint Thomas? How does Saint Thomas take this up, and what does he have to say about the idea of universals or this Platonic idea? Because again, he was an Aristotelian primarily.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, St. Thomas is influenced by a lot of people. I think it is right to say that he takes up Aristotle more than anyone else as far as his resources go. And like Aristotle, he rejects the idea of separate forms, right? But he also rejects the idea of illumination, which Plato didn't have clearly in his own work. I would say Plotinus maybe did, but that's later. So the reason St. Thomas rejects this, interestingly, has two sources. One, he just is an empiricist. That is, he thinks that we gain knowledge through experience. So he adopts the Aristotelian view that all knowledge begins in the senses. So he just takes that as sort of an epistemological starting point. He just doesn't think that we should focus on innate knowledge. And the Platonists, and this is true of Bonaventure and Augustine, it's all about interiority for them, right? Like what you need to do is withdraw from the world around you, right?
Yeah.
And then you need to find that illumination within you. And that's very influential in Christianity, very influential in the monastic, kind of culture and ethos. But St. Thomas, he thinks, no, that's not really actually how we learn. He thinks that we learn through experience. And I think that's his most important sort of objection to this, is that, we need to have universals, but we learn from experience. The second thing is he doesn't think that we need an additional light to the light of reason, because he thinks the light of reason is already based on the light of God's mind. So reason itself is already an illumination within us, right? So we don't need an additional one. But I think that first point is really the most important, right? Is do we learn from through the senses? And I would say, yeah. I mean, if you deprive somebody of their sense experience, they're going to know pretty much nothing,
right?
Yeah. So that I think that's St. Thomas's objection now, but he still wants to hold on to the idea that there are permanent and universal truths, right? And that's key, right? So St. Thomas doesn't say, well, we learn through experience and therefore all truth is changing in particular, right? St. Thomas isn't a relativist, right? So then we have to think, okay, well, fine. If we learn from experience and all things in experience are particular and changing, okay, how do we get to these universal truths? And so this is the fascinating part of St. Thomas thing. It's just really interesting. He thinks embedded within the material world, embedded within this world of change that we experience, there are structures and patterns that underneath kind of all of the change that we experience and all the particularity we experience, underneath that, there are structures and patterns that are universal and unchanging, um, embedded within the world of change.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the first thing that comes to mind is, just thinking about the human person, the
Mm-hmm.
language that we use is made in the image and likeness of God.
Sure.
That
Mm-hmm.
somewhere in, each human person we can, I don't necessarily want to say catch a glimpse of God, but
Mm-hmm.
there's,
Sure.
a reflection, or something,
Sure. Yeah.
there's something to each human person that, with the eyes of faith, that we can see
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah. And
unchanging truth about him. Yeah.
that's something that can be said of every Homo sapien,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And always, right? So that's key, right? Is that both those things? It's a universal truth, right? Um, so of course, St. Thomas is aware that in saying this, he's saying, well, all knowledge begins in experience, but what we experience is particular and changing. And so how do we find and discover this permanence right underneath? Now, first, I think you can just kind of appeal to common sense, and to say, look, this is the way humans actually think. We don't think everything is changing and everything is particular,
Right.
right? Our normal default position is to think, well, there are natural kinds, to use philosophical language, right? There's such a thing as the species of badger, so we can identify, oh, look, there's a badger, and there's another badger,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, over time and across places. So the even so, the question remains: okay, well, how do we know that? Like, how do we get that knowledge? And this is where he brings in the theory of abstraction. The theory of abstraction, I don't want to get into too far with the details, but
Sure.
just basically that we can distinguish, right?
Mm-hmm.
Abstraction really comes down to the ability to make distinctions. That we can distinguish the permanent from the transitory. We can distinguish the universal from the particular. It's not always easy, but we can go through this process. And one of the places I've experienced this directly when for all the years I was teaching logic. Um, when we go through the first part of logic, right, that always involved definition, right? We
Right.
would do a couple of weeks in definition, and that was always a fun and frustrating part of the class. Like I really enjoyed it. Actually, I enjoy. It's terrible. I enjoy the frustration of the students because you say, okay, well, let's define some things. Let's define lamp, right,
Yeah.
or salad, or something like that. And it's really hard, especially with those kind of artificial things, right?
Yeah.
But we can, if you start working on it, you can sort of get to the place where you can say, okay, I can peel away what is accidental, what is secondary, right? What is transitory about a human being, right? So, I recently got a haircut. Maybe our viewers can tell, right? And I was very pleased. And I like to tease my children that my hair was about, I think when I got my haircut, maybe almost as long as yours right now, Jason. Maybe not quite, but
Yeah.
almost. And I would tease my kids and say, well, Dad's starting to look like a hippie. I need to get a haircut, right? But even I, right, went from a little bit longer hair to shorter hair, right?
Yeah.
That you can gain weight, you can lose weight. Um, those are transitory. You wouldn't say, oh, well, Dr. Smith lost a little weight, therefore he's not a Homo sapien anymore, right?
Yeah.
Well,
What?
no, like there's something permanent there, right?
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
we
So,
can and we can see, like, or in, at least in my mind right now, there's so many instances popping up when people talk about, like euthanasia. Well, the person is knocked unconscious. Okay, well, how have they
right.
ceased to be a human person? I mean, there's just
Right. Yeah.
so many different accidental changes
Mhm.
that do not
Right.
necessitate a substantial change in what the thing is.
Yeah.
Uh,
So that language is important there, right? Of course, essence and substance, right? And St. Thomas, following Aristotle, but I would also say kind of developing Aristotle, would say that what subsists, right? So taking that word
yeah,
substance, actually, whenever I teach metaphysics, I try to stress this. It's best to use the word substance as a verb, right?
As a verb,
What
okay.
subsists, right? What perdures, right? Is what you're talking about. And what perdures in the human person at a foundational level is his essence, right?
Right.
So essence is what perdures. Now that's important, right? Because St. Thomas, as I said, thinks that universal truths, that there are universal and permanent things embedded within reality. Well, what is that? And his answer would be essence.
Okay.
So what the human mind does is it abstracts. So you are a man, I am a man, right? Human beings. Um, you are sadly unbearded, whereas I am wonderfully bearded, right? So, right. Nevertheless, I recognize your humanity, Jason, despite your lack
You're so
of being
merciful.
bearded.
You're so merciful.
I'm accompanying you in your
That's right.
lack of.
To the peripheries.
That's right. So I can see that there's that sort of accidental
Right.
thing, but underneath we can distinguish that there's still this essence, which is the human being, Homo sapien, to put it in Aristotelian terms, rational animal, right? And so that's what subsists. Now we form what St. Thomas said. We form the word man, right,
Yeah.
and we apply it to all humans. That term, right, man, that idea, man, has these kind of universal features, right,
Sure.
that say you or I as individuals, men, don't have, but that universal idea of man really refers to something. It refers to
Yes.
something in reality, and what it refers to is your essence and my essence, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Now, is this what we would just call human nature?
Yeah, human nature. I think for these purposes, that's fine. And um, you know, then you could still say, well, Jason and Ben are not the same individual
Right.
man, right? Even though we're both men, and that's because of our individuating accidents.
Right.
So this is a
Right.
key here, right, for St. Thomas's. I wasn't born of the same parents that you were born of, right? This is going to sound weird at first, but your particular parentage is accidental to your humanity.
Right.
Does that make sense to say, right? Like my
Yeah.
parents, Steve and Christine, right? Like obviously when I use the word accident here, I'm using a very technical sense,
Sure.
right? But their being your parents is not necessary for being human.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So in that sense, it's accidental to my humanity. Obviously, it's not accidental to my individual existence. Okay?
Right.
But it's accidental to me being a human, right? If it wasn't the case, then what you'd have to say is something weird like, if you're not born of Stephen and Christine, then you're not a human, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And it's when you, let's see, let me think of the right way to I guess put this, that even though they, in a way, they are a cause of your humanity or in
Of
your
course.
existence, they are not the cause of your human, or they are not the formal cause of your human nature.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, they are secondary efficient causes.
Right.
So, it'd be fun. Next time I see him, I'm going to do this. I'm going to say, hey, secondary efficient causes of my being. How you
Happy secondary efficiency cause day. That's right.
anyways, um, yeah. So they are efficient causes, but not formal causes,
Yeah,
right?
and this is where, the idea of causality is
Mhm,
so
mhm.
important and comes into play here as well.
Yeah.
So,
Now, so something that's going to come up here and it's important vis-a-vis our Franciscan theologians we're about to talk about in later medieval philosophy, and this sometimes sort of grates on kind of modern sensibilities, right? Is what I have to say, Jason, is that your individuality, right, from a Thomist perspective, I'd say classical Augustinian, Aristotelian, Platonic, everybody that's wise perspective. Right, I'm not partisan.
yes, sir. Not at all.
From that perspective, your individuality is metaphysically second, right?
Mm,
Yeah, see, we don't like that.
yeah, no. I am, I define who I am,
That's
Ben.
right. That's
Ben.
right.
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
like, yeah, and that's the other thing that I think is important, like with this whole understanding of human nature is,
Mm,
uh, especially when the discussion turns to modern things like, gender theory and like all these
right.
other things is, if I get to decide, metaphysical realities about myself,
Mm,
then what is our human nature based on?
yeah.
Is it
Mm,
just simply based on a spiritual autonomy or something? Like what is
right.
it? And I
Hmm.
think that's something that for Catholics having these discussions is when
Hmm.
these things come up. Say, okay, well, what is the basis then of our
Sure.
human nature
Sure.
if we
Yeah.
really if everything is self-defined, if you
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
define absolutely everything about yourself, why should I hold that you have that you have the same dignity as I do? Can't I just define that I have more dignity than you? you know I
Right.
mean,
Right. Yeah.
like, there's
Yeah.
I think this has a lot of big practical consequences when you
Mhm.
reject things like human nature and kind of
Sure.
those ideas and stuff.
Yeah. And in saying this, look, I'm not saying, I think, obviously,
Right.
right, that your personality, your individuality, your individual character is unimportant.
Right, right,
Okay.
right.
But what I am saying is that it's metaphysically second,
Yeah,
right? So let's take let's say you could take the various temperaments, right?
yeah,
Or your particular way of using language. Let's say that you're a poet or a musician, right? And you're like, oh man, you're saying my musical ability is less defining than my humanity. Well, in a certain sense, yes, I am saying that. But
yeah,
just think about it for a minute, right? You are able to be a musician because you're a rational animal,
yeah,
right? You're able to be a husband or wife because you're a rational animal, right? Those things about our individuality, I'm saying they're secondary. That doesn't mean unimportant. So an issue we revisit regularly on this podcast, right, is the ability to make distinctions and rank things,
yeah,
right, but still keep them connected, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
hard, right? I found for people, but once you get it, it's helpful. So I can say, look, your individuality is important, your personality is important, your character is important, obviously. But our ability to even have such a thing as character, right? Like
yeah.
dogs aren't truly vicious, right? Nor are they truly virtuous, okay? Because they don't have the rational faculties by which you would be either virtuous
Just
or vicious,
right.
right? Um, Sorry to offend everybody now. So I talk, said
Just
something
don't
about
talk about
dogs.
cats. Just don't talk about
Oh, no, well, you're right. There's no question cats are vicious.
cats. And
Sorry.
and
That's not even a
evil,
question.
objectively evil.
All right. So I think that that's really important to grasp.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, and now, um, do I need to say anything more about that? You got
No,
any
no.
questions?
I think it's one of those things. There's certain things that are more foundational than others.
That's right. Yeah.
And even when we say things like it's secondary, like you said, it doesn't mean that we're saying it's not unimportant. And we're also not saying that just because it's secondary that God doesn't care about it or He doesn't want to see it develop in a virtuous way and things like that. No, God cares about all of these things, whether they're first or second or third or anything like that.
That's right. Yeah.
It's just in our thinking, in our understanding, in our application and development of policies, laws, philosophies, in our ability to understand the world according to the mind of God, to understand reality as it was created, the design.
Mm,
We have to use this language
sure.
to make those distinctions without losing connections.
That's right. Oh, good. Good. That's well put, Jason. Let me just piggyback on that just and say maybe something that may make this seem a little more appealing. Let's say that you've got a particular vice, right, that you've developed over time, right? So that there's a certain vice that's bothering you, corrupting your life, giving you moral challenge. That's part of your individuality too, right?
Yeah,
Like that's part of your individual kind of character and makeup. But it's still, and thanks be to God, we can say an accident, right?
yeah,
Like I can say, okay, yeah, maybe I'm struggling with gluttony or pride or wrath, right? Wrath as a vice. Okay, fine. Um, that doesn't define my humanity, me at the essence, right?
Right.
I can, in fact, change that,
Yeah.
right? So maybe that's a way of kind of seeing how this is actually appealing, right? That is I'm not actually defined completely or fundamentally, I should say,
Right.
by my vices. My vices are things that can be changed.
And I think it's important for us when we look at our identity and who we are, and also when we talk to other people and they're talking about who they are, you should not, and you should not let them define themselves by their accidents.
That's right.
You know,
Yeah.
and that's one of the things like
Not or not define themselves foundationally.
yeah,
Right.
foundationally of
Yeah. Right.
wrapping up their identity in these accidental things of whether it be a virtue or a vice or something like that. Like no, there's something more foundational here, and that's what we're
Absolutely.
trying to get at.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. So I hope that's clear to our listeners. This is, I think, kind of a deep, key, important insight of medieval philosophy, as it developed within the medieval period, within the medieval university, within a culture, an intellectual culture, right, that was profoundly Catholic,
yeah,
right, and profoundly Christian. However, over time, and there are a lot of historical kind of concrete reasons that we can't kind of go into here, but at the level of ideas and the level of philosophy, we can recognize that eventually that kind of Thomist way, kind of I would say the classical perspective that kind of synthesized both the Neoplatonic and Aristotelian views was unraveled, and it was unraveled. I'll just say primarily by Franciscan theologians, right? And I'm going to point out two in particular. And I think studying medieval philosophy brings this out. And it's really interesting because there is a tendency, Jason, you and I have talked about this, to kind of think like it's like an intellectual or historical version of the seamless garment, right?
yeah.
Right. Usually that's applied in contemporary moral debates, but I think there's a kind of like good Catholics sometimes I think have this tendency to want to say, there just weren't any controversies in Catholic tradition before the Protestant Reformation, right? And that's just false.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just false, right? Even saints, even blesseds, right,
Yeah.
disagree sometimes deeply, right, with each other, right, and so and so there is a kind of, I think, even within the bounds of the legitimate church, room for dispute and pushing back and forth. That doesn't mean that it's just that all of a sudden everything becomes relativistic or anything goes, but I think we do have to recognize that even within the medieval period, which we think of as a profoundly Catholic period, nevertheless, we find important controversies and disputes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's even a great letter. I think it was Saint Augustine called Saint Jerome an ass, like in a letter that he wrote. So I mean, so it wasn't just between like the saints in the world. It wasn't always this struggle.
That's right.
There
That's
I
right.
mean, there
That's
were
right.
some real disputes between saints themselves. And
That's right.
in
That's
this
right.
case, it was Franciscans and primarily Dominicans.
That's right. That's right. And historically, I think this is interesting. The Franciscans won at the time, right? That is
Yeah.
for really the 14th and 15th century, the Franciscan tradition becomes the predominant tradition. In particular, I want to talk about two Franciscan theologians here, Scotus and Ockham. Blessed Duns Scotus is born really in the 13th century. He's active in the 13th century, kind of the late part. He's active in the late part of the 13th century. And he's called the subtle doctor, right? And he's called the subtle doctor for a reason, because he is a genius, right? I mean, there's no doubt about it, all right? And when I teach medieval philosophy, I spend a great deal of time going through Scotus because he thinks in scholastic terms. He is scholastic. He knows his Aristotle, for sure. But almost everywhere where Thomas zigs, Scotus Zags, right? It's really interesting. They use the same Latin language.
Yeah.
They use the same scholastic methodology, right? But Scotus develops I would say, radically alternative philosophical view, right? It's subtle at first,
Yeah.
right? But once you start teasing it out, right, it actually is very significant. When people are comparing Scotus and Aquinas, very often what they do is they talk about the doctrine of analogy and univocity. We're not going to talk about that as much. I do talk about it in the course. But for our purposes, when you think about universals, the key move that Scotus makes, right, that's really interesting, is he wants to say that the distinction that we've made between essence and accidents is not a real distinction, but merely a formal distinction. And so he wants to say that in reality, your essence, Jason, is Jasonness.
Yeah.
Right.
That's my essence. Yeah.
Or benness.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Actually, to be perfectly honest, it's a little scary, but I
really don't want that to be a thing. It really shouldn't be a thing.
That to be a thing, right? I kind of want to maybe be purified.
Yeah.
But anyways, so sometimes this is called heseity, right? This is taken from the Latin term haec, right? HAEC, right? Which means this. Right? Yeah. So if you kind of thisness, right? So that the distinction between your virtues and vices, the distinction to the reality that you are married to a certain person, so that relation, right? That is not an accident to what you are, but part of your essence, right? Now, it's really interesting to think about that, right? Like, say and when I teach this, some people find it I think this is attractive to modern people.
Yeah.
Because we just love our individuality so much.
Yeah. And I think I mean the thing that comes to mind is that that scene from Gladiator, where the emperor comes out on the in the gladiator ring, and he's like, "Who are you?" And then Russell Crowe turns around and he's like, "I am so and so, husband to a murder wife, father to," and he talks about all of these things as his identity. I mean, everybody that saw that scene was like, "Yeah, that's that's a man." But at the same time, like, when somebody asks us, who are we? Those are kind of the default things that we go down and describe. Yeah. So I mean, I think in our contemporary practice, those things are definitive of our identity, which is all right, I guess, but it should be distinct. Yeah. It should be distinct from our thinking when it comes to the reality of these things.
Yeah, so this is just the thing, is you just have to think carefully, right? And with discipline on the matter.
Yeah.
So let's say that you go from not being married to being married, right? You've taken on, right, what metaphysically speaking is an accident. That is a relation to another person, right? That you did not have before, right? Now, when people hear that, they're like, "Oh, is it an accident that I'm married?" Look, just think about it, right? Were you a Homo sapien before you got married?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, obviously, or you wouldn't have been eligible for marriage, okay? Right? So it doesn't define you according to your species, right? That's what we're saying here, right? Obviously, it's important. Obviously, right, accidents are significant. They're distinguishing. They're informing. All those sorts of things, right?
Right.
But we also need to recognize that they are metaphysically second. Now, let's say that you're married for a while, and then your wife dies, sadly, right? Right. So you were a husband, and then you become a widower. Well, did you cease being human?
Right.
No. Now, is that change obviously devastating and important? Of course it is. It's important, but it's not your species, right? That's the tone perspective on it. So you just have to think that way about it, right?
Sure.
You still remain ontologically, like say you're experiencing grief. You're experiencing grief, yes, because you lost a wife, but the possibility of losing a wife is itself derivative on having been a human being,
Right. Right.
right?
Right.
Like you can't lose a wife, right? Unless you are a human, okay, right? And so again, right, that there's an ontological priority to essence there from a Thomist perspective. Scotus wants to push against that and say, no, that the essences are really singular, right?
Yeah.
Um, and
How did he kind of work this out, or did he work this out, or did he kind of just gloss over this idea with the accidents?
well, he thinks that so there's this thing called the formal distinction,
Right.
right?
Right. Okay.
So this is a wonderful medieval thing to say. We have to distinguish kinds of distinction. Okay. But this is what I love about medieval philosophers. They're so precise, right?
Yeah.
Say you're talking about somebody being to the left of the left of a pillar or to the right of a pillar. The classical example. That's a merely logical distinction. Logical here, just in the terms of like based in the mind,
Right.
right? So like lots of arguments actually revolve around this kind of thing, right? Which is like doesn't really matter, right? Like arguments with my kids, like so often revolve. It's to the left. No, it's to the right. Well, it just depends on where you're looking from,
Yeah.
right? Okay. But anyways, then there are real distinctions, right? So you and I are really distinct, is
Right.
what Scotus would want to say.
Okay.
And Scotus has a clear way of making this distinction. He says they can exist separately,
Okay.
right? But what he's going to say about your being married cannot exist separately from your substance, and therefore it's not really distinct,
Oh.
right?
Okay. Okay.
From you. See how he's slick, he's subtle,
Yeah.
man. He's a subtle doctor. But what he will say is that there's a formal distinction. So the formal distinction is kind of a halfway house. There's the real distinction on one hand, there's the logical distinction on the other. And
Yeah.
the formal distinction is, well, one half of that can exist without the other, right?
Right. Right. Right.
But not the other half, right? So
Yeah.
you can exist without being married because there's a time in which you existed and you weren't married. But your being married can't exist, right? Without you. Now, a good old Thomist like myself would say, well, what you're pointing to there is the difference between substance and accidents, and they're really distinct, right? But
Yeah.
Scotus is saying, nope, they're only formally distinct because they can't. Those two things cannot exist separately apart from each other. Therefore, they are not really distinct things.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's subtle, but it's important because where does this take us then with Ockham?
So in terms of ethics, and I know we're running along here, but it's just a big topic. The Scotus starts to move in the direction of what I would say is a kind of divine command theory,
Okay.
right? He does keep teleology in the picture,
Mm-hmm.
but interestingly, and maybe this is a topic for another discussion, but he doesn't think that teleology is the foundation of morality. That is, he doesn't think that perfectionism is the foundation of reality. Merely striving for your happiness is useful and delightful, but not bonum enestum, right? Not the authentic good. Think
Yeah.
about how interesting that is, right? The whole classical tradition, really, Augustine and Aquinas and all these folks, they would say, oh, the high, like the
highest
the
good.
raison
Yeah.
d'etre, right, of morality is seeking happiness,
Yeah.
right? Seeking your perfection and actualization. Scotus says, nah, it's not it, right? What is it is what he would call, so is justice, right? And that comes down to obeying the law because it's the law. So in some ways, I think in the Franciscan tradition, there's a anticipation, right, a Kant on that point,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So he distinguishes between the what he calls the commodious or it's almost kind of impossible to translate, but the commodious inclination of the will and the inclination towards the just, right?
And that's why
And
we all
it's
have a duty to.
that's
And
right,
morality
yeah,
is
yeah.
duty. Yeah.
That's right. Morality is duty. Morality is based on law, not based on perfection and happiness. Now, he would add very quickly, and I want to be clear about this, that following the law and being happy run parallel,
Right,
right?
right, right.
So he doesn't divorce the two things entirely, but he does again subtly distinguish them, right? He's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
they're these two things are not the same. So that's where it goes in terms of the ethical sort of implications. Now, Occam, is in a sort of way, I really kind of enjoy Occam, not because I think he's right, but he's just sort of like a bulldozer. He just latches onto a couple of things and just intellectually just runs all the way through, right? And so Occam, who is a 14th century thinker, right? So he's born in the very end of the 13th century, I think, but his activity is into the middle of the 14th century. Um, Occam is what's called a nominalist, right? And that is, he says, you know what, SCOTUS, you're right, but you didn't go far enough.
Yeah.
That's the key, when you think about Occam, I think. Namely, says, you know what, not only is there no formal distinction between essence and accidents, right?
Hmm.
There just are no universals at all. Everything is individual, right?
Yeah.
And you can kind of see how you would make that logical progression there.
Yeah.
So for Occam, literally, it's true that everything is different, right? All the way down.
And changing. And changing, right?
Yeah, that's right, and changing. Yeah. So for Occam, right? So he's called a nominalist, right? Because he thinks that universals are merely nomen,
Names.
Nomen, right?
Yeah.
Merely name, right? So that when we use things like man, the term man, or the term badger, or the term triangle, those are not things in reality, and they do not really refer to anything. They are convenient terms that group, I would say, our thoughts and interior concepts, right?
Yeah. So let me
And I
let me
think
let me train let me translate this for our listeners.
okay.
Everything is a social construct.
That's one
That's
way to think
I mean
about it. Yeah.
that's what a lot of arguments, oh well,
Uh-huh.
this is a social construct, that's a social
Yeah.
construct, like everything that, this
Mhm.
argument comes up a lot, that it's just, you're just putting a name on something,
That's right.
like, and this is not a new idea, it's just a recycled wrong
Yeah.
idea.
And I would actually say, of course, contemporary people are just blastedly inconsistent, right?
Yeah.
We talk about, on the one hand, human rights, right? As it, like, and then on the other, we tend to be nominalists, right?
Right.
We tend to be completely like, no, there are no universals except for human rights. Like,
Yeah.
well, I
What's
don't
the
know, but
basis of those human rights if there's
that's
no
right. That's
human
right.
nature?
That's
you know
right. That's right. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, it makes no sense at all. But yeah, so the way Occam puts, yeah, to just kind of build on what you're saying there, they're conventional signs,
Yeah.
right? The things that happen inside of your mind, inside of your body, in reaction to your environment, are what he would call natural signs, right?
Yeah.
So we are responding to our environment, but then we put words on top of that in order to communicate it, right? That are merely conventional. Now, he thinks that that's important, right? He
Yeah.
thinks like we need to be able to communicate with each other, and he doesn't think. So this is really interesting. In an odd sort of way, he anticipates Ludwig Wittgenstein, great name for a philosopher. Uh, Penn Smith is not that great for a philosopher, but
You
I mean,
sound like you're
if
in
it
a
was
witness protection program or
Heinrich Wittgenstein, that's pretty good stuff, right? But
something.
anyways, so Ludwig Wittgenstein is a 20th century philosopher, but he was also a nominalist, but he had this idea of what he called family resemblances, right? And so he would say, kind of like if all the Gales got together, right?
Hmm.
All the Gales by blood, we'll say, and they were all standing around. They wouldn't look the same,
Yeah.
but there would be some sort of like, oh, well, this one looks like that one, and that one looks like that other one, right? And so there's some kind of group similarity grouping we can do, right?
Yeah.
Without, right, we say, oh, you can, because like, look at a big family photo, you could say, you can kind of see how it hangs together. Wittgenstein liked to put it that way, because there's enough resemblance in the aggregate, right, in the group, to say, oh, there's the Gales, right?
Right.
Um, but there's no such thing as galeness, right? Is what both Ockham and Wittgenstein would say. Um, so it's interesting, right? When you look at it that way, again, Ockham kind of knows what he's doing. Now you could say, well, then what do we do with ethics? How should we behave? And this is where Ockham's voluntarism comes in, right? That is, well, look, what we have basically what it comes down to is the will of the sovereign, right? Is the will of God. And that's why he follows sort of a divine command approach. Of course, in addition to that, this leads to widespread skepticism.
Right.
If there are no universals, then there are no deductive certitudes, right? If there's no truths, to go full circle in our conversation today, if there are no universal and permanent truths, right, then you cannot deduce anything with necessity. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Then everything is changing. Everything is changeable.
Everything's changeable. Everything's particular.
Yeah.
Right. So this case of adultery is bad, but maybe that one's okay, right?
Yeah.
Because every act of adultery is different.
Right.
Darn it.
Right. Well, again, that's why when you base when the basis of your ethics is authority.
Mm-hmm.
Then
all
and that's all it is. Then especially what happens then when you get to the complete separation of church and state. Well, then all morality becomes democratic. If you live in a republic or a democracy,
or tyrannical. Right. It's just the most powerful person decides, right?
Yeah. Or it's just complete individual. And that just leads to chaos and anarchy. But
and really instructively, I mean, this is exactly what Plato talks about at the end of the Republic, right? He starts to, in those last chapters, last books, he really points to this kind of chaotic anarchy and breakdown of order, both within the human being, and within the city.
Yeah.
When we become ignorant of the universal and the unchanging. So I think, just as a kind of a plug for the medieval course, I really think medieval philosophy, why do I need to study that, right?
Yeah.
It is so relevant to every human situation, I would say, but especially to our own, right? Because the issue of, just think about this, okay? Universal and unchanging truths, right? Is that important? Right? Is it important in our time? Is it important for our souls? Right? And I would say, obviously, yes.
Yeah.
Right? And we can see, right, even within medieval philosophy, even within a profoundly Catholic civilization, right, the gradual breakdown of those very kind of foundational ideas that are required for true understanding, required for wisdom, and required for moral order.
Yeah, and clear thinking. I mean, it's such a important thing, especially today when we're not thinking very clearly, and we're thinking by either our emotions or by some false ideas. That we need to sit down and think through, what is the basis of you holding this position? Is it you're just skeptic of everything, or is it because you really don't think that there's human nature, or to actually sit down and work through these things. Well, I hope our listeners have gained hopefully a historical perspective of maybe how did we get some of the things we have today, where did we get them? A lot of it's during that medieval time, and and of course the ultimate I think lesson is ideas have consequences.
Sure,
and that's why I think
Jason, you're wrong. The ultimate lesson here is that the Franciscans ruined the world. I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
Yeah. So, but ideas have consequences, and it's important for us to think, to try to think as clear as we can, and to seek in those times when we're not thinking clearly, to seek wise guides. And that's a big part of what we're doing at Catholic Studies Academy, is trying to introduce and reintroduce and essentially have Catholics begin to almost date these wise thinkers, to walk with them and to bring them into their daily life and thinking. And so with that, I want to invite everybody to check us out at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Until next time, God bless.